It was a cold, foggy evening in the small town of Ravenswood. The streets were empty, and the only sound was the distant ticking of the old clock tower. Detective Arthur Blake sat in his dimly lit office, staring at a pile of unsolved case files. His pipe rested on the table, and the smell of tobacco filled the room. Blake was known as the best detective in town, but even he couldn't solve every mystery. Just as he was about to call it a night, there was a knock on the door. A young woman, dressed in a black coat and hat, stepped inside. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling. "Detective Blake, I need your help," she said in a shaky voice. "My uncle, Mr. Harold Whittaker, has been murdered." Blake leaned forward, his interest immediately piqued. "Tell me everything," he said. The woman, whose name was Clara Whittaker, explained that her uncle was a wealthy businessman. He had been found dead in his study earlier that evening. The police had ruled it as a heart attack, but Clara was convinced it was murder. "Why do you think it was murder?" Blake asked. "Because of this," Clara said, handing him a small piece of paper. It was a note that read, "12 red herrings will lead you to the truth." Blake frowned. "Where did you find this?" "It was in my uncle's hand when he died," Claire replied. Blake decided to take the case. He grabbed his coat and hat and followed Clara to the Whittaker mansion. The house was grand, but had an eerie feeling to it. The study, where Harold Whittaker had been found, was filled with books, paintings, and a large mahogany desk. Blake examined the room carefully. There were no signs of a struggle, and everything seemed to be in place. However, on the desk, he noticed 12 small figurines of red herrings, neatly arranged in a circle. "What are these?" Blake asked. "My uncle collected them," Clara explained. "He loved puzzles and mysteries. He always said that the truth was often hidden in plain sight." Blake picked up one of the figurines and examined it closely. It was a small red fish, beautifully crafted. He noticed something written on the bottom, "Look beyond the obvious." Over the next few days, Blake interviewed everyone who had been in the house that evening. There were 12 people in total: Clara, the butler, the maid, the cook, Harold's business partner, his lawyer, and 6 guests who had been invited for dinner. Each person had an alibi, but Blake sensed that someone was lying. He decided to focus on the 12 red herrings. He believed there were clues left by Harold to reveal the killer's identity. The first clue was the note, "12 red herrings will lead you to the truth." Blake realized that each figurine might represent one of the 12 people in the house. He began to investigate each person's background, looking for any connection to the figurines. The butler, Mr. Jenkins, had been with the family for over 20 years. He seemed loyal, but Blake discovered that he had recently borrowed a large sum of money from Harold. Was he in debt? Could he have killed Harold for money? The maid, Mary, was quiet and kept to herself. Blake found out that she had been overheard arguing with Harold a few days before his death. What were they arguing about? The cook, Mrs. Higgins, was a cheerful woman, but Blake noticed that she had access to Harold's food. Could she have poisoned him? Harold's business partner, Mr. Thompson, had been struggling with financial problems. Blake wondered if Harold's death would benefit him in any way. The lawyer, Mr. Grayson, was a close friend of Harold's. He had drafted Harold's will, which left most of his fortune to Clara. But why would Harold leave such a cryptic note if he trusted his lawyer? The 6 guests were all friends of Harold's, but Blake discovered that one of them, a man named Victor, had a criminal past. Was he involved in the murder? As Blake dug deeper, he found more clues. Each figurine had a small inscription on the bottom, and when put together, they formed a sentence: "The killer is among you, hidden in plain sight." Blake realized that the key to solving the mystery was to find the one person who didn't fit. He went back to the study and examined the figurines again. This time, he noticed something strange. One of the figurines was slightly different from the others. It was a slightly darker shade of red. Blake picked it up and examined it closely. Inside, he found a small piece of paper with a name written on it, Victor. Victor was one of the guests, but why would Harold point to him? Blake decided to confront Victor. "Victor, I know you're hiding something," Blake said. "What's your connection to Harold Whittaker?" Victor hesitated, then sighed. "All right, I'll tell you. Harold and I were partners in a business deal years ago. It went bad, and I lost everything. I blamed him for it. But I didn't kill him." Blake wasn't convinced. He continued to investigate and found out that Victor had been seen near the study on the night of the murder. He also discovered that Victor had a motive. Harold had recently cut him out of a new business deal. Blake gathered all the evidence and presented it to the police. Victor was arrested and charged with Harold's murder. The case was finally closed. As Blake left the Whittaker mansion, Clara stopped him. "Thank you, Detective Blake. You've brought justice to my uncle." Blake nodded. "It was the 12 red herrings that led me to the truth. Your uncle was a clever man. He left behind the clues to solve his own murder." Clara smiled. "He always loved a good mystery." Blake tipped his hat and walked away into the foggy night, ready for his next case.